teach English webinar course. Shaping the way we teach English. Webinar Wednesday.
Welcome to Shaping the Way We Teach English Webinar Course 15, brought to you by the American English team. My name is Jenny Hodgson, part of the American English team based in Washington, D.C. So welcome teachers from all over the world. As you probably already know, during these webinars, you will hear but not see the presenter, and the way for you to participate is in the chat box, just as you are already doing. This is where you can make comments and ask questions related to today's topic. You will also see the moderators, myself, moderator Jenny, and Heather and Katie in the chat box to help you. You may also see questions in the form of polls. These will be multiple choice questions that appear on the screen. We know that sometimes people experience technical difficulties, and unfortunately we can't fix each individual technical issue, but we will let you know if there is a global problem. But a great way to follow along if you lose sound is by looking at the caption pod, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. Webinar courses consist of 6 webinars, and during the course they take place every other Wednesday. If you attend at least 4 out of the 6 webinars, you will receive an e-certificate from your U.S. Embassy or Regional English Language Officer. To ensure you receive your e-certificate, we do ask that you submit your attendance only at the very end of the webinar. You only need to submit your email address if you are watching this individually. If you are watching this with a group, then you need to include the number of participants. We hope that you are all already familiar with the Ning site. This is the site where you can access pre-discussion questions related to the topic, readings, and then after the webinar you can access the PowerPoint and the recording and ask the presenter additional questions. So today is the last webinar of Course 15, but Course 16 will be starting very soon on April 22nd. And this is a special course because all of the topics will be presented by an English Teaching Forum author. How many of you are familiar with the magazine English Teaching Forum? Please raise your hand. This is our quarterly academic journal written by teachers for teachers, and we hope that most of you have seen it. But there is a new version of Forum, so if you have not seen the new Forum, please check it out on our website. So we're looking forward to an exciting series for Course 16, and if you'd like to participate, please register through your RELO or U.S. Embassy. For today's session, the webinar is entitled Reciprocal Teaching Reading Strategies. This webinar will include both proper speaking and listening skills. The inclusion of public speaking opportunities with English language learners is often neglected. Providing public speaking experiences in an EFL classroom can promote greater oral communication among the students. Along with supplying opportunities for verbal expression, the use of reciprocal teaching to encourage reading comprehension will be discussed. An effective method in strengthening reading comprehension is through the teaching of others. This metacognitive approach helps students understand the reading content through explanation of this content to other students. These practices will be integrated in the webinar presentation along with practical applications. Our presenter today is Dr. Rob Dannon, an English language specialist who was a senior fellow based in Russia. Rob was a former faculty member at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, and he worked directly in the development of an English language village in South Korea, an English language and Western cultural experiential learning environment. Rob has been involved in project development and international consultation regarding English language education programs, and has also worked extensively in educational curriculum, program development, teacher preparation, and training. Welcome, Rob. We're looking.
Thank you, Jenny, for that introduction. And before we get started, if I could have you raise your hands and let me know if you can hear me, I would appreciate that very much. Good, thank you. I hope that my volume is loud enough for all of you. And thank you for letting me know that at least some of you can hear me. But let's now go ahead and get started. As Jenny was saying, the webinar for today is reciprocal teaching and how you use it for reading. And I will discuss the notion of reciprocal teaching in the early part of my webinar. You'll also notice at the bottom of this first slide my website, and that has additional resources on reciprocal teaching as well as many other teaching strategies, some which I'll refer to during this webinar. Please feel free to access any and all of that material. It is there for you to use, free of charge, of course, and to adapt it and make use of it in your own classroom. And so what I'd like to do now is just refer to some of the poll results from the lobby that you just filled out. And it's great to see that over 50% of our participants today are interested to learn about reciprocal teaching. So I feel good about us being here together and learning and sharing, because I know through our pre-webinar discussions that many of you have used reciprocal teaching type of strategies in your classroom. As a matter of fact, for the participants today, according to the lobby poll, about 50% have used it, 50% haven't. So we will be able to share in the expertise of others who have used it and increase the knowledge for all of us. And the last part I'd like to talk about in the poll, the lobby poll, is over 95% of you who responded feel that reciprocal teaching is an effective teaching strategy. So yay. So let's go ahead, and I hope to confirm that with all of us today that it is highly effective. Now, before I go on, I made reference to pre-webinar discussions that I've been having with many of you, and I appreciate those conversations. What I'd like to highlight before I actually get started is a couple of points that had come up more than once, and I think they're worthy of talking about at the onset. And the first one is, how does reciprocal teaching work with lower level academically performing students, lower level English proficiency students? And I believe that it can work very well, and I'll try to refer back to it. Please make comment to it as we go along. The reason why I think it can work well is because you adapt it to the needs of your students. They work in small groups, and those groups can be developed and created around the ability levels of your students. So therefore, your higher level students can be in a group and working together. Your lower level students can also work in a similarly proficient level grouping. And so therefore, they will be able to work in a similar level of academic performance. The choosing of the materials that you use, which we'll discuss, can be adapted to the level and proficiency expectations and considerations of your students. So yes, I think it can work well for all levels of students. Another area is, what about using reciprocal teaching in large or whole group instruction? This is something I would not recommend. It really is truly intended for cooperative learning groups, small groups, and I'll refer to that throughout. I do not think this is a strategy, however effective it is in teaching reading, It is not really effective to use it as a whole group procedure or strategy. I would reserve it for small cooperative groups. And the last thing I want to highlight at the beginning, and I'll come back to this throughout the program, particularly at the end, is what about the shy and reluctant student, especially when we ask them to speak up, because there is a great oral emphasis to this process. And so, yes, it will work for them. As a matter of fact, you will hear a student talk about that at the very end of our presentation on the last video clip that we'll see. The reluctant student, and it can work with the support of their classmates, their teacher, and the notion that they will be working in small supportive groups is a great start for the shy student. And so with that, I'd like to get started, and we will address many of these things as we go along. So the first thing we will do is now watch a short introductory overview of reciprocal teaching. So let's take a look.
Reciprocal teaching is a process that students engage in to help them improve their comprehension of difficult texts. In this first of two segments, Stephanie explains to the class how this process works, followed by a group session of reciprocal teaching in action. There's a definite protocol followed during the session which involves a high level of student participation, talk, and thinking. The end goal of using this strategy is for students to independently and naturally follow the steps to deepen their understanding of any text format.
So over the last few weeks, we've been working with a process called reciprocal teaching. And reciprocal teaching has 4 phases, 4 stages. Okay? What is the first stage in reciprocal teaching? Nina?
Predicting.
Predicting. And what is it that we do when we're predicting? What are we doing when we're predicting? Michael?
You take a guess about what the text is going to be about.
Okay, you're guessing what the text is going to be about, and you're using the cover, the back cover, table of contents. You're scanning the text to kind of take a guess, like you said, about what the text is going to be about. Now, in reciprocal teaching, you actually take your before reading prediction, and then afterwards, you confirm or reject your prediction after you've read the text. So before you read the text, you make your prediction. After reading it, you confirm or reject your prediction. What is the next stage in reciprocal teaching? Vivetha?
Clarifying.
Clarifying. And what is it that you do when you're trying to clarify something?
You're clearing something up that you don't understand.
Clearing something up that you don't understand. You're asking yourself questions like, where is this place located? Or what does this word mean? I'm really confused about this part. So that's how you're clarifying things that you read about. And what's the third stage in reciprocal teaching? Anjali?
Questioning.
And with questioning, we have to make sure we ask deep questions, that we can start asking questions about the author's purpose. We can start thinking about who is this text written for? What is the actual meaning of this text? And the last stage of reciprocal teaching is what? Christy?
Summarizing.
Summarizing. And summarizing is just stating the main ideas as briefly as possible. So in your guided reading groups,
Well, it looks like, at least from my end, that last question by the teacher is the last stage of reciprocal teaching. Did not get shown, at least I did not see it. But I forgot to mention there was a poll questions related to each stage of what comes first and second and so on. And in following those polls, yes, your responses were correct. Oh, I see that it was shown. I just did not see it myself. So good. I'm glad that you got a chance to see and hear the teacher's explanation on the 4 stages of reciprocal teaching. And so, and again, thank you for responding via the polls. So let me go ahead and go to the next slide where we can talk about these 4 stages in the order in which the teacher and the students presented them. The first one, in terms of the reciprocal teaching reading strategies, which also relates to a proper sequence of instruction in teaching reading and comprehension, is the use of prediction. Prediction of, as it was said in the video by the teacher, predicting by asking clues, confirming predictions that you think what might be the part of a story or a text material and how it might end up at the end. A chance to reject your prediction, your hypothesis or not. And many of you use this as an introduction to your reading materials with your students in order to get them ready for the reading and the comprehension that goes along with it. The next step is the clarifying and understanding the elements, the vocabulary, the setting of the text is a place to clarify those critical elements. And that happens throughout the process of reciprocal teaching. And we will go ahead and talk more about that. The next stage that was discussed is questioning. And that's why I like where the teacher in the video talks about asking those deep questions. Those are those critical thinking questions, the essential elements of the text that hold the most meaning and can have the most profound effect on the reader. What is the true meaning of the text that they're reading? That is what the questioning is about. And many times the clarifying and the questioning stages, in my mind, are interchangeable. One can come before the other because they really are supportive of one another. You clarify much of what you're trying to read and understand through questioning and inquiry. And the last step is the summarization, is the review of grasping the main ideas of the text, helping to remember and therefore comprehend what the message of that material was all about. And let me go back real quickly, because I'll come back to this later. When we talk about predicting as an initial process, an initial strategy to get the students involved in the reading, many of you, as I said, do all of these things. I know that through our pre-discussions. But also, the predictions may not be exactly what is occurring in the text itself. But if your students come up with a close enough, a fair enough prediction that they can justify and rationalize, then to me, they have an understanding of what they're reading, because not always is there one right answer. And this allows students to construct their own meaning through this process, which I think is very important as well. So let's go on and talk about some of the key factors in reciprocal teaching. And this was one of the questions I asked in the pre-webinar discussion prompts that I had, and about speaking and listening, because that's something we don't do enough of necessarily in our classes. I think we're starting to do that more, both here in the United States, where I am, and other parts of the world in our EFL classes. And in talking with teachers, as I do and work in other parts of the world, and in talking with you today during pre-discussion, many of you also see the necessity in stressing speaking and listening as part of foreign language instruction. And that's encouraging, because reciprocal teaching relies heavily on both speaking and listening. And so it really does tie into the 4 skills of learning: listening, speaking, reading, particularly those 4. And if you see in this little graphic down here, if I can get my arrow to work, There we go. These areas here in orange are the key elements, the listening, reading, and speaking of reciprocal teaching. Writing, which is an expressive form of communication. Reading and writing are more receptive. Speaking and writing are more expressive. But those three key elements right here are the heart of reciprocal teaching. Writing can be served as an extension to it, which I'll talk about more later. So what I'd like to do is tell you why reciprocal teaching is called what it is. This is the educational theory behind reciprocal teaching, in the fact that teachers and students work together in reciprocal roles, in similar types of roles, meaning that students become the teacher. They therefore teach each other, and they learn from each other, and they reciprocate in the learning process as the teacher typically does. So that's what the notion of reciprocal teaching means. And I'll just quickly highlight some of these things because I've already talked about them. Also on the Ning, I have, and I'll make reference to it again at the end, a literature review on the educational research on reciprocal teaching and reading that you're more than welcome to look at and to read, and that'll give you more of a theoretical background on best practices for reciprocal teaching. So it does promote public speaking, as I talked about in the previous slide and the graphic. It does particularly encourage receptive language. Thinking aloud, by having to speak and having to listen, it provides an opportunity for students to think out loud and in their reciprocal teaching of each other. And that work really comes from Lev Vygotsky, a Russian educational theorist, which many of you know. And there's more material and information on Vygotsky on the Ning website under my webinar about Vygotsky himself and many of his educational theories, which still hold true today. Therefore, it helps with comprehension, and it helps in the teaching of others. And let me just talk just a few seconds about that. The teaching of others, you know, as teachers, you know how we obviously are up in front of the class, thinking out loud, speaking to our students, answering their questions, clarifying concepts and skills. And when we don't have the right answer or enough of an answer, then it forces us as teachers to research that and come back with answers that are more in depth than what we may have started with. And we may have done mentoring in our professions. And that's the same thing. When we talk about skills and concepts and strategies, it forces us to think about them and to become better at them because we understand them better. And we have to explain them better. And so when the students become the quote-unquote reciprocal teacher, they are in that same situation where they have to think out loud, they have to share their knowledge and clarify what they're thinking, and therefore their learning becomes better as well. And so if you do those things, it works out. I really feel that to be the case. Now here, we're just going to briefly talk about this slide here. And I just want to highlight this right here, this SWBAT, SWBAT. And what that focuses on, what that means is students will be able to. So this is a very student-centered approach to instruction because we're focusing on what the students can do and know and demonstrate, not as much on what the teacher teaches because we know they will do that. We want to see what the students actually know. And that deals with the metacognition that was talked about in my introduction. And there's an article on the Ning under my webinar that talks more about the notion of metacognition or thinking about thinking. And this also allows the students to draw on their own meanings, that very constructivistic approach that I was talking about under prediction. So, so many elements are embedded, so many theories, so many practices are embedded in this procedure in terms of teaching reading, not just in reading itself. And it teaches cooperative strategies, and I'll come back to that. Some expected outcomes is also something I'll just briefly touch on. It's, as we've been talking about, not only the comprehension, but the long-term retention of the reading materials, the concepts that you're learning that you hopefully will remember beyond just this reading activity. Understandings that you can take to other classroom settings to utilize in other types of learning situations. That's the true meaning of the retention of materials and concepts that are being taught. Reciprocal teaching reinforces that. It also helps with leadership skills, going back to that shy and reluctant student. What about they, in small group, as I said, now taking on the role of quote-unquote teacher, and they starting to learn, as the other students, on how to lead. This may be their first opportunity, and it's a small success that will hopefully open them up to greater leadership roles down the road. And cooperative learning strategies, as I've mentioned, but it also helps with information gathering and problem solving, which are great research and study skills that they can generalize beyond this one activity into other classroom situations and educational settings as well. Let's now talk about the materials. There aren't that many materials in which you would need to be responsible for because so much of this, as I said, is student-centered. The use of a KWL chart. Not that it's necessary, but I really think a KWL chart works well for this type of reading instructional strategy. Many of you in your pre-webinar discussions talked about the use of KWL. If you wouldn't mind raising your hand using the little man icon, how many of you have used KWL charts or know about them? If you could let me know, let the rest of us know. I see that many of you have. That's great. And there's many other opportunities to use KWL, and we'll talk about how it relates particularly to this reading strategy. But great, I'm glad to see many of you use it. I think it's a very useful instructional tool in many different settings. I'll briefly talk about lesson planning and lesson plan itself because there's resources out there that you can delve into, and I know we all do lesson planning, but if you want to have a more structured lesson plan around reciprocal teaching, I will come back to that. The assessment component, the use of a rubric, and you may also show me, you can unraise your hand for the last question about KWL and show me and show the rest of us how many are familiar with rubrics, because we will go over that as well. And I'll ask that question again later. Obviously, the reading text, the reading passage, the reading materials that the students will use for this reciprocal teaching strategy, that may be something that you've given them to do for homework the night before. It could be during class time. And let me just say, when we talk about large groups, that while this isn't good for large groups, they could possibly be reading their reading passage while a small group comes up and works with the teacher, who works with them for about 10 minutes. They go back and do independent work, and then the teacher brings up another group to do reciprocal teaching, and because they've just read the materials. So there's a way of doing this in small groups while the rest of the class, the larger group, is working on independent work. Could be even group work. So expository text, I think, works best. And the reason for that is expository text is nonfiction. It provides information, cause and effect, problem solving, comparing and contrasting, concepts that are easier to attain and have discussions on and clarify than maybe nonfiction, particularly if you're doing this process for the first time. And I would also suggest, and this helps with all levels of learners, not just the lower level, to pick that expository text under a proficiency level under what the students typically can do. Some easier material, both in terms of reading comprehension and language proficiency, because it will now let the students read the material without being as confused or caught up in the actual material itself while you're trying to focus on the actual procedures that go with and the lesson sequencing that is part of reciprocal teaching. So therefore they can focus on the process of that rather than getting hung up on the reading material itself. You can add, if you do this procedure, this reciprocal teaching over a course of time, you can increase the level of proficiency of your reading material, but first start out easy. And if you do use this reciprocal teaching over a course of time, be choosy as to when you use it and when you don't use it, when it's appropriate, when it's not. Because we as teachers, don't you think, have a tendency to use a good instructional strategy and then overuse it, and it loses its impact if we use it too much, too often. And then I'll talk more about the teacher, in quotes, that means the student as teacher, those prompts in just a little while. So let's go ahead and talk about the KWL chart, as many of you said that you are familiar with. Let's look here. The pointer shows the K column of the KWL chart. And the K, as many of us know, stands for what I know. In other words, the teacher is asking the students, okay, students, we're going to talk about a certain, or you're going to read about a certain topic today. Let's find out what you already know about that topic before we study it further. This is that pre-knowledge, the prior knowledge that we always try to do with our students so we and they have a better understanding of the foundational knowledge of the topic which we're learning about. Gives you as a teacher a good sense of what they already know and how to build on that. And it gives the students a quick check of their own understanding and other students' understandings that they will be sharing with each other. So let's do a brief exercise with this. In a little while, I'm going to show you a sample of a reading passage that I used when I taught reciprocal teaching, and it's about the history of dogs. So let's do a little role playing, if you will. And I'm going to ask you now, as let's say you're the students, I'll say to you, students, we're going to be reading a text on the history of dogs. Who of you can now share with the rest of us what you know about dogs? So if you wouldn't mind, right now in the chat box, participants, just going through the simulation with me and listing what you know about dogs. And I'll try to highlight some of your responses. So let's see what we have. Adele says dogs are loyal. Yes, many of them are. Great. Let's see what else others know about dogs. Sandra says dogs were wild before they became pets. Thank you. Thank you, Sandra. What other pre-knowledge do you have about dogs? They are faithful, as Sonia has said. I'll read one more. And thank you all for responding. I wish I could get to all of them. They bark. One of our participants said that they bark, and how true. And so that's the idea of using the K part of the KWL chart. It's the prior knowledge, what the students already know. It is, as we know, in terms of teaching in general, that's a good initial instructional strategy. Let's move on to the W. This is the place where we ask that question to our students. Students, what do you want to know? That's the W part. Want to know about the subject. You already told me what you knew about dogs. What are some things that you want to know about dogs that you may not know? So participants, if you could do the same simulation and list some things that you may not know about dogs that you would like to know. And I'll read off some of your responses. Jonathan says, do dogs go to heaven? That's a good question. Maybe a hard question to answer, but certainly an interesting one. Another participant said, Etta said, what is the best way to train dogs? Let's try one more. Asiya, what are the different types of dogs? Great. See, the questions that we're going to try to answer during the course of our reciprocal teaching lesson. Now, let me just say something about questioning and inquiry. I think it's the heart of instruction. And you will start off, as we're doing here, with initial sets of questions that you hope to answer through the course of your readings. But with all good inquiry-based instruction, you're going to end up, the students are going to generate even more questions later on during instruction. And that's a good thing. That lets you know that students are really thinking deeply, as that teacher said in the video, and questioning deeply, because you will get additional questions. And you may not be able to answer all of those questions during this lesson. And that is okay. You just come back to it later. You add it on. It becomes an extension of this lesson for future lessons. And I'll talk more about that when I talk about springboard activities. So that's a good sign if you end up with more questions than you can answer. But you certainly try to answer many of the questions during the reciprocal teaching. And the last column is what I've learned. And we won't do that as an exercise right now, because that's truly the lesson closure. And I'll come back to it certainly, and we'll talk about how it's used to close the lesson as a quick review, informal, reflective exercise, an assessment on the understandings that the students have at the end of the reading. So we'll come back to that. But that, in essence, is a KWL chart. And think about using it if you've never used it before. It works quite well. And now on the lesson plan, I will only talk briefly about this, as I said, because many of you, I'm sure, have seen Katie Bain's webinar recently on lesson planning. I watched it myself, and it was very useful. And if you haven't had a chance, I highly suggest you watch it. It really gives you the key elements to lesson planning, and it helps reinforce the lesson planning you're already doing. I also have lesson plan development on my website, where it has information and resources as well. So, and I know we all do lesson planning, so I will not spend much time on it now, but obviously it's an important part of all teaching. You explain the process, obviously, and the prompts that the quote-unquote teachers will have. I'll show you those. And I'm just going to highlight some of these things that hopefully you can just quickly review now. And also, the teacher will use a rubric, and I'll come back to that briefly also. A lesson plan template that I have used when I did reciprocal teaching, and it's listed, the completed lesson plan for my reciprocal teaching lesson is on my website at robdannon.com, as it shows right here. And feel free to use that. You can print it out if you'd like. You can just use it or adapt it. It's there for your use. It's a lesson plan that I used using the SIOP lesson plan format. And SIOP, which is right here, stands for Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. A very long term, and what it really means essentially is materials and resources, including lesson plan formats and other instructional resources that ESL teachers in the United States utilize, and many EFL teachers in other countries can use it as well. Foreign language teachers It's well tailored to our use. And so take a look at that. But these are just some of the areas that we've already talked about that are highlighted in my SciUp lesson plan, including critical thinking, higher level thinking skills, your instructional materials, your supplemental materials. Again, that could be for those students who have particular needs, learning disabilities, have a lower level of competence. That's a place to include some of those supplemental materials to differentiate. And let's just talk briefly about these areas. The anticipatory set, it's the introduction of the lesson. That's where you establish the prior knowledge that students have. That's that review that we just did in the KWL chart. In fact, that is the K part of the KWL chart. And then the instructional sequence that we typically follow, the direct instruction. That's the teacher giving directions on how to use reciprocal teaching, role modeling it, explaining all parts of it. The guided practice is actually the students doing the reciprocal teaching strategies and with the teacher's guidance and help and the other students' guidance and help. And the independent practice can come through extension, springboard activities, writing assignments that we'll talk more about. Now, you may not do all of these three in one lesson. This may take several lessons, and that's okay. And so a little bit more on the SciUp lesson plan, again, which is on my website. I will just highlight these. And we all know the importance of lesson sequencing and pacing. And you can look at, again, Katie's webinar to get more of that. I will talk more about the rubric and other forms of assessment. And the lesson closure, as I referred to earlier. That's going back to the W. As you come near the end of the lesson, students, did we answer all the questions of what did we want to know? And then you go through this as a review. Let the students do the reviewing. Let them be thinking out loud to help them process that at a deeper level. And then find the questions that may have not gotten answered, as I said before, and use those as springboard activities. And springboard activities is really a term meaning an extension. You will use these questions that didn't get answered as further inquiry activities. It can be independent practice, like I mentioned. It could be group presentations, finding the answers by a group of students to those questions not answered, and presenting it to the class. It could be in written form as a research project. There's many different opportunities to extend this lesson beyond the one lesson itself. And then down here, it's the review. It's the L part of the KWL chart. It's what have I learned? And again, allowing the students to highlight and say out loud and process and hear each other discussing the key elements of what they've just read. It helps to establish both for you and the student whether they truly comprehend and retain the information that they're reading. Now let's talk about student responsibilities. We've talked about the teacher's responsibilities. Now it's, again, this is very student-centered, this type of instruction. So obviously students need to take on some of the responsibilities as well. And when we talk about rubrics, which we will in just a few minutes, I would like to have you think about maybe including what I'm going to discuss in this slide, included in your checklist or your rubric in terms of what the students are responsible for. Obviously, they're responsible to read the passage. Again, either at home for homework or during class time at their seats. They become teachers, again in quotes. They become reciprocal teachers for their small cooperative group. And by being teachers, they take turns in their role as teacher, either as a predictor, questioner, qualifier, or summarizer. Now, when I've done it, I've had different students. I had a group of 4, and each student takes on one of those specified roles. You'll see in a video, a continuing video from segment based on the video that you just saw, of this teacher having one student be all 4 roles. And that's okay. The next time she'll pick another student to do all 4 roles. There's no set way of doing this. Have it make sense to you, what meets your needs, your student needs. It is quite adaptable. And so some other student responsibilities is the fact that the students need to, with you, go over the prompts, which I'll share with you. And the teachers need to lead. There's that leadership component again. Even for the shy, reluctant student, here's their chance to take on a leadership role in a safe, supportive, small group environment and lead the group discussions. Let's talk about rubrics. Now, if you don't mind, one more time, in the raise your hand function, will you please share with all of us if you are familiar with and or if you've used rubrics as a way of assessing your students? Okay, many of you have done that and have used it. Great. You'll see my website listed here again, robdannon.com. I have an actual rubric that I developed for reciprocal teaching in the lessons that I taught. If you just go on my website under reciprocal teaching, you will see it there under a link. Feel free to use it if you'd like, as I said, or adapt it. It's there. I also have on my website a separate rubric design link with resources on rubric design and how to best utilize rubrics as a form of assessment. I hope that you find use in looking at those materials on my website. But let's just briefly go over this, the use of a rubric. I think it works very well in this type of instructional setting for these reasons. It allows the students and the teachers to reflect, and we'll see what that looks like in a little while. In a critical, deep way, it really highlights the essential elements of what students need to know. It's authentic, meaning it's real world. You're working and trying to reinforce skills, not only reading comprehension skills, but other types of skills, metacognitive skills, higher level thinking skills, that sort of thing, that they can use not only in your classroom, but in other classrooms, in other aspects of their lives outside of school. They can take those ways of critically analyzing and applying skills that they're using during this reading exercise in their professional and personal lives later on. That's true learning and ongoing lifelong learning. It deals with real-world thinking strategies. You please discuss the rubric with your students before using it so they have a full understanding of what they need to focus on, what they'll be assessed on. I think it's only fair to the students. I think you would agree. One nice thing about using rubrics in a reflective sort of way, and you'll see this being done in a video clip later, is that you can give immediate feedback right after the exercise, right after the lesson. Sometimes it's called washback. And think about when I say washback, waves washing back on shore. It comes back immediately to the shore, and that same notion can be applied to giving feedback immediately to students right after they've gone through an instructional lesson with you. So it's close to what they've just done. They remember it better, and the feedback will be better understood and remembered because it is relevant to the exercise that they just did. That's the idea of washback, giving immediate, comprehensive feedback that stays with the student. And peer evaluation. Students can evaluate themselves. Their peers can evaluate each other in a constructive criticism process. And I have examples of those on my rubric design on my website. So please feel free to look at those. Well, here is now the sample of the passage that we were referring to in the history of dogs. And this is just a segment of what I used with my lesson. It's expository. And the bold underlined words that you see, such as tame and wild and roamed, shy and suspicious, are the key vocabulary words I wanted to highlight and talk about with my students prior to actually them reading. Part of the anticipatory set of the lesson at the beginning. Let me just read this to you, just to give you a sense of some of your responses, both to what you already knew and some of the questions that you had. You were very much in line with this short passage. It says here, many years ago, in the days when people lived outdoors or in caves, there were no tame dogs. In fact, all the animals of the world were wild. One of those wild animals was the wolf. Wolves roamed through the fields and forests, shy and suspicious of humans. Yet, from these wild wolves have come all the different dogs that are pets today. I just thought it's interesting to share that with you, give you practice with your oral, my speaking and your oral skills, auditory skills, and but it does tie in to what we were doing as a simulation. I think it's interesting. Now let's talk about those quote-unquote teacher prompts, ways of helping the students when they become the teacher, to help them in their roles as teachers. Now, I purposely have shown you all of the prompts that I have listed on one slide, and I'm doing this for a reason. It's part of a whole strategy that many of you are familiar with. It's based on learning styles. Many of us, including adults, including teachers, like to see all of the materials that are going to be presented before they're broken out into their separate parts. Then they may be brought back together at the end for closure. That's what I've done here, is to give you a sense, for those of you who learn best that way, how that might serve your needs. Now let's go ahead and look at these individually. And I'm going to ask you in the chat box to make some responses to these in just a moment. Here is some suggested prompts that the predictor can use in their role as a reciprocal teacher. And notice that these questions deal with the K part, the prior knowledge of the KWL chart. Here are 2 prompts. The first one, what do you think we'll be reading about today? And what evidence suggests that we'll be reading about that? So they have to provide rationale as to why they are predicting why they think the story is going to be about, what the story is going to be about. And so in the chat box, let's see if we could do a quick role play here with the idea of dogs and the short passage that I just read to you. Participants, pretend like you're students, and what do you think we'll be reading about today, and what's the evidence? What is your rationale that we'll be reading about the history of dogs? So if you would do that, I will try to highlight some of your chat responses. Nohav in Egypt said, we'll talk about the history of dogs. Very straightforward. Yes, you've got that right from the title. I know many of you in your discussions with me prior have talked about skimming and highlighting titles of stories. That is a great predictive strategy. The history of dog evolution from Costa Rica. Correct. How wolves became dogs. That's from the American Space Organization out of El Salvador. The origin of domestic dogs from Bolivia, and the evolution of dogs from Bolivia. And so, yes, that's exactly how this is being used. So thank you for sharing. Let's go on to the next one now. Questioner. This is a prompt that the questioner can ask. And again, this is the W part of what do I want to know of the KWL chart. Let's do a quick chat on this one too, if you don't mind, participants. What do you want to know from this reading passage about wild dogs? Okay, you told me what you already knew. What more do you want to know about dogs? If you'll please share now in the chat box, I'll try to highlight some of those. Luis Durango from Mexico, how do they stop being tame? Great question. How do they become pets? From Payman in Iraq. Relation to other wild animals from Hassan in Oman. Noah from Egypt said, how did wolves become dogs? Elizabeth also said, when do they become domesticated? Nurnia, how wolves became tame. Yes, wonderful questions. And if we did this as an actual exercise with our students, we would keep generating more and more questions. And that's the beauty of this. Inquiry is the heart of learning. Let's go on and thank you. I wish I could read all of your prompts. I'm glad that you're sharing with others to read as well. This is truly a professional development opportunity for all of us. So thank you for being part of it. Here's the clarifier prompts. And this also is the W part of the KWL chart. What do I want to know? Here are the two prompts. The first one, is there anything that you would like to clarify that you need further clarification on? It could be vocabulary, it could be terms, it could be questions that were asked that you don't understand what they're asking, things like that. The other prompt is, are there any words or anything else you're not sure about? So let's do that as a quick exercise one more time, if you don't mind. And in the chat box, go ahead and list some points that you would like clarified regarding the history of dogs text that we are working with. And I'll try to highlight some of them. What is tame? That's a great question. And hopefully you as the teacher have explained or have the students explain what tame means. And so therefore you can do that at the beginning. But also if anybody wants to give a definition now of tame, please do so in the chat box. I'll let you go first before I give a response to that. And what is roaming? Right, and see, the questions that you're asking are great. Now, you really may be asking because you're not sure what those words mean as actual participants now. But if I did my job at the beginning of the lesson by going over, which I didn't do during this exercise, but if I had gone over the vocabulary terms with you, you would not have to ask that question. And if I explained it well, you wouldn't ask for it to be clarified. So this is a quick assessment for me as the teacher. If my students are asking me questions that I thought were answered, it lets me know I haven't done a good enough job of answering those questions, and I need to go back and monitor and adjust and reteach those. So it's a great learning assessment for the teacher. So tame is being friendly, as someone has said. Tame is the opposite of not being wild. Great. And roaming is, just moving about over great distances, typically, not with any particular destination in mind. So thank you. This prompted me to be thinking about and adding to my knowledge to share with you about the questions that students ask can be used as an evaluation for ourselves as teachers on how well we actually taught something, or do we need to reteach it. So thank you, participants, for helping me in my own learning. Now, summarizer is the L part of the learning of the KWL. What have I learned? And so the summarizer could ask these prompts. The first one, I will try and summarize what we have just read and discussed. Another question is, does anyone have anything they'd like to add to my summary? Now again, as I've said before, it might be better for the summarizer to ask the second question first. Does anyone have anything they want to add to my summary? And then let the summarizer fill in whatever may be missing. And then you as the actual teacher could fill in even more. That's the guided instruction component. And so that is really a way to do this. It brings that review, that closure, that what have I learned part of the KWL into focus. And the whole notion of guided, I've been talking about guided practice, that's scaffolding, if you've heard that term. And that also is Lev Vygotsky's educational theory. And if you read more on Lev Vygotsky, again, it's on the Ning under my website. There's a resource link there. He talks about providing support, both by teacher and fellow students. Now, thank you for doing that with me and for sharing with each other. Now I'd like to do another exercise which will include the observation of another video excerpt in just a moment. Again, I'm doing a whole part whole explanation here. And this actual development chart, if you watch the whole video in its entirety, which you can find on the Ning under my webinar, you will see this lesson development chart under my website. And if you want to watch it and take further notes, this chart is there that you can utilize to take those notes. But what we're going to do in 3 different parts, the first part is this one right here. I'm going to have you observe students working in their reciprocal teaching group using predicting, clarifying, and other these forms of strategies. I want you to observe which of these actual 4 stages, these 4, you actually see in that short video clip. And that will be done in the form of a poll question that we'll come back to. Then from there, we'll do in the chat box, how can you take what you saw in the video, what you already know about reciprocal teaching, and what we've talked about so far in this presentation and make it your own? How are you going to make some of the strategies work for you? And then we'll bring it to a whole again, bring closure to this exercise in the chat box by doing an overview of the whole process as it makes sense to you as a teacher. And that what are the first steps that you may take to get the reciprocal teaching process working. So let's go ahead and now watch the short video clip and observe what the students.
This is our second meeting with this text to do reciprocal teaching, and this text is exploring space. And what we're going to do is go through the process. We're on chapter 2, and I'd like to ask anyone who'd like to be the leader for today's session. Nina, you haven't been a leader so far. Why don't you take it this time?
Okay, today we'll be reviewing what we read yesterday. We've been reading chapter 2, Shooting for the Stars. It's on page 13. Does anyone have any before reading predictions that they would like to share?
I do. I thought that the chapter would be about how they first got to space, because the title was Shooting for Stars, but you can't really go to the stars, so I thought that they meant space travel.
My prediction for this part of the text was, I thought this text was going to be about different types of stars and how they are identified. I predicted this because in the title it contains the word stars. Also, I skimmed through the text and I saw pictures of animals. I know that constellations create images, but not only of animals, but also of objects. Lastly, I saw a picture of a boy and a girl using space technologies to look in the sky, which looks like it's filled with stars.
After reading the text, does anyone have anything that they would like to share?
I'd like to confirm my part of my prediction when I said the text would be about stars, because inside the text it did talk about different kinds of stars. I would also like to reject part of my prediction when I said it would be about shooting stars, because it wasn't about shooting stars and it wasn't only about stars.
I would like to confirm my prediction that it was about stars. However, it was also about how students make rockets and a timeline of space. I did not predict that, so yes. Does anyone have any clarifying that they would like to know about words or text?
On page 14, one of the stories, it mentioned Jupiter. I'd like to know what Jupiter is. Is it a name or a planet?
I think that Jupiter is actually named after a planet, but it's actually named as a god because it says the king of the gods. And Jupiter, as we all know, is one of the biggest planets in the solar system, so that's probably why they called it the king, because Jupiter is also the biggest.
Okay, we got to see the students in action, at least a little bit in this video clip. And the poll questions were to observe which of the, as you see in this slide, which of these stages of reciprocal teaching did the students do that you could actually observe. And through the poll questions, you were right, that you saw both the predicting aspect here, and you saw the students doing clarifying. Now, what we didn't get a chance to view is the questioning and the summarizing, and that's only because we didn't watch more of the clip. If we had continued to watch, you would have watched the students doing these other two stages as well. And again, you will have an opportunity, if you want, to watch this entire video at another time. So thank you for participating in that exercise. Now, from what you've observed and what you know and what we've been talking about, let's go on and talk about these. In the chat box, as you reflect right now, just off the top of your head, how can you use each of these elements, each of these stages in your own classroom? Or how have you used them so we can benefit from your knowledge? So if we could start by, in the chat box, explaining how you would use prediction, or how you have used prediction, particularly in reciprocal teaching strategy-wise, in your classroom. I'll try to highlight some of your comments. Brainstorming, I see, from Arely in Mexico. And using prior knowledge, exactly. And that's the K part of the KWL chart. Showing pictures, Asia, showing pictures, using different strategies in terms of prediction, like many of you have done and have shared in the past. One more, Asana, trigger my students' knowledge. And we have already shared some ways in which to do that. Thank you. How about this? If you'd share in the chat box, what would be some of the ways you would help the students clarify the key concepts, the elements of the text in which they'll be reading? How would you go about doing that in your own classroom? If you'd please share. Asking for main ideas was one. That is a good one. Checking vocabulary. Yes, like we talked about, you want to make sure the students truly understand those vocabulary terms. And any other unknown words, as Pedro in Mexico has just said. And having the students themselves define the words. Excellent. Allowing them to be in charge of their learning and understanding with your help. Great. How about this one? Questioning. If you share in the chat box how you may go about questioning. How you would get your students to ask those types of clarifying questions. True, false questions. Quick review. That works well. Scanning and skimming may bring up, as someone has mentioned, Dimba has mentioned, that can also help bring out further questions. Let's see if I can answer a couple of more. Ask their own questions. Have them come up with more additional questions that was just suggested. Mind mapping. I see the word mapping here, and I take that to mean mind mapping. And that's Hassan in Oman. That would work very well too. So thanks. Let's go on to the last one. Summarizing. Could you please, in the chat box, share with all of us, as you have been doing, some ways that you would get your students to summarize and review the key concepts at the end of the lesson? Through assessing, through rephrasing, I'm seeing. Let me see if I can read a few more. Recapping main ideas. Yes, and there's many different ways of doing it, and it's particularly helpful, as we've been talking about, letting the students do the recapping, not the teacher. Refer back to the KWL chart. Yes, bring back all the different aspects of it. That is a great idea to bring closure. Thank you for sharing that one. And so thank you. I'm going to move on. I wish I could share more of these, but I'm hoping that you're getting to see many of these responses from your colleagues. And it's great for all of us to be able to share in each other's collective wisdom. So thank you. So I'm going to move on at this point and bring closure to this part of the exercise. It's bringing it back to the whole, like I said. And one more chat response for now is, let me just read the directions as it says on this slide. Please share in the chat box some of the first steps you would take to begin your reciprocal teaching process with your students. So in the chat box, and I'll try to highlight some of these, overview how you're going to put this into practice and what may be those first steps. And let me just say, as you're writing these down, that I actually have a checklist that starts from the beginning of the reciprocal teaching planning process all the way through the implementation to the closure. I have a already established checklist on my website under reciprocal teaching, which is called the Reciprocal Teaching Teacher Reference Sheet. And it's a handy checklist to make sure, if you're doing this for the first time, especially, that you have considered all the parts that you need to. So please look at that. It's on my website. It's also on the Ning. So how would you start out by doing this process? Brainstorming, I see. Assign the roles, right, and maybe role model the roles that you have. That's Elizabeth in Peru. Thank you for that. Of course, starting with prior knowledge, as we've been saying, and predicting as well. Those are all great first steps. And using different types of predictive strategies. I'm seeing brainstorming, matching pictures, role-playing. The list goes on and on. I'm hoping you're seeing many of these, and I appreciate it. Sharing of rubrics. is a great way of doing it, and adapting other rubrics to meet your needs. So I appreciate that, Asim, for sharing that. Having a short conversation related to the topic. Roosevelt mentioned that you could also collaboratively work with your fellow teachers and putting this together and really have a professional development and learning community around this. So great. So let's move on, if you don't mind. And what we're going to do is do one last video clip. This is now related to the closure, the assessment part of the activity, of the lesson itself. And in this slide, you see it says student reflections. This is really not only student, but it's also the teacher reflections and how these students in this video clip reflected on their own understanding and appreciation of this learning activity. And the teacher will do it as well. And you may have noted that the teacher took notes in the previous lesson clips that we saw. And the students took notes too. And now they're going to reflect on those notes, that washback. But notice that the teacher goes first. Also, one more thing to look at is notice what the first student says in her reflections. After we watch this video clip, we will come back and I'll ask for your own reflections as well. So if we can now watch this video clip.
Another question. How do you feel about this process of reciprocal teaching, of reading a text and meeting together as a group? Oh boy, we have a lot of opinions here.
If you're shy sometimes, like it'll help you talk more with your ideas.
It helps you learn new things that you didn't know before.
I really like this process because I was able to understand more words and I could understand what my next steps were and my clarifications, which I really couldn't understand even though I looked in the book and in the glossary and in the dictionary. I understand them a little bit more now that I could share with somebody.
It's really helpful because we all don't have the same prior knowledge, so if I didn't know something like about space, maybe Nina or Josh knows it.
It helps us change our opinion about the book, like how I changed my summary using this conversation.
And what I noticed and what I enjoyed about this and why I enjoy meeting with the groups and discussing it is that I get an opportunity to see the different strategies that you're using. For example, when someone had a question about multi-stage, someone was using word study to try to solve their problems. And Nathan, you used your prior knowledge based on a book that you read at home to solve the questions that we had. So I'm learning a lot from you and the way you solve problems and the way you try to break down the text and comprehend the text. So I really enjoy this conversation and I learn a lot from you just by listening.
Okay, thank you for watching that. And did you notice what the first student said? It helps the shy students. And so while I feel it does, it's nice to get that confirmation from a student themselves. And so notice how they shared their thoughts, and then the teacher followed up and added her thoughts and her washback reflections at the end of their reflection. So, in your personal reflections as we close out this session, are you considering any changes to your teaching of reading, even if you've used reciprocal teaching and other forms of these strategies in other ways in your classrooms? Are you thinking about making any changes? And hopefully some of those changes would be in a reciprocal teaching reading strategy format. If you wouldn't mind sharing, and I'll try to highlight some of those. And while you're writing, a person asked earlier that I didn't get a chance to respond to. The question is, how long should this lesson take? And that's a good question. Think of it, the actual reciprocal teaching small group session could probably go on, depending on the level of the student, the age of the student, the topic in which is being discussed, I would say on the average 10-15 minutes. Now, of course, you may need to adapt that. There'll be prior reading either in class or at home. There may be extensions and springboard activities that come later. But this would incorporate the actual group time would be about 10 minutes, and then another group would come up. So a teacher could go through maybe 2 or 3 groups in one sitting in one lesson time period. And then you just come back. Again, this isn't necessarily a one lesson event. It can be extended, and it probably works best if it is extended. So thank you for asking that. And so let me just see. I see a lot of positive comments, and I thank you as well for taking the time to share with each other, share with me, help me in my learning. I hope I've been able to help you as well. So thank you for the positive feedback and for your encouragement. And I wish you the best in all aspects of your teaching. And I hope you get to use reciprocal teaching in your classrooms, especially if you haven't used it before. And finally, I just like to show these references. I've already made mention of them. I just want to quickly highlight them. And there's the first one is the reciprocal teaching literature review that I wrote, and is on not only my website, but it's on the NEAN website under my webinar presentation as well. It gives you, again, a good brief overview, let's say, of the educational theory and best practices about reciprocal teaching. Now, these two are the entirety of the YouTube video that we watched excerpts from. It's in 2 parts, part 1 and part 2. Altogether, it takes about 15 minutes to watch both parts. It might be of use to you to watch it, and I have that chart that you can make notes on my website. And also on the NEAN, that's also on my website, is the teaching rubric that I've developed for reciprocal teaching, the SIOP lesson plan. I've got that teacher reference sheet, that checklist that helps you walk through the steps of reciprocal teaching. I also have a student guide that I mentioned in the form of a handout where students can be taking notes and reflecting and using those notes and prompts within those that handout that help the students to focus. And then on the American English AE website, there's also an English teaching forum link to an article on reciprocal teaching that focuses not so much on reading, but on students speaking and talking. So that may be an extended area of interest in reciprocal teaching that you may want to delve into. Again, thank you, and I appreciate the time you've had with all of us, and I wish you the best. Please stay in touch. I'll be posting post-webinar discussion questions. Also on my website is my email. Please stay in contact with me. I'd love to continue this conversation. Thank you again, and have a pleasant rest of your day wherever you are.
Thanks so much, Rob, for such an interesting presentation. Let's get